In this lecture, we are going to talk about income inequality. So we're going to talk about the determinants of wages, what causes income inequality. Sometimes in this lecture, we're going to talk about income inequality. We're going to talk about the determinants of wages, a bit on discrimination and differences between wages between different groups, what causes income inequality, and some possible solutions, and how economists analyze poverty. So what determines wages? Well, there are a lot of different things that go into determining how much different people get paid for different jobs. So first we can think of compensating differentials. So some jobs are more fun than others, some are more dangerous and risky than others. So you could imagine that a job would be paid a different wage based on how risky or how fun that job would be. Fun jobs would get paid less wages, all else equal. Risky jobs would get paid more wages, all else equal. Some jobs also require a lot of education and training in order to be able to perform those jobs. You could think of doctors as a great example of this. So jobs that require more upfront investment require more of what is called human capital. So these jobs will also command higher wages. Some jobs are located in locations that are more or less desirable, so these jobs would also be paid different wages depending on where the jobs are located. Unions historically have had a large effect on wages. So you could think of a union in economic terms as workers grouping together in order to gain market power. So since workers are suppliers of labor, you could think of a union as basically having a monopoly on working. So what happens when there is a monopolist in a market? Well, the price goes up and the quantity traded goes down. So here you could think of unions as leading to a higher wage in the labor market in which they're located, and fewer workers would be hired. The last non-monetary determinant of wage that we could think about is efficiency wages. These are when companies pay workers a wage above the equilibrium wage in order to get workers to work higher, decrease turnover, increase productivity. So just to expand a bit on human capital, this chart shows median annual earnings for different education levels. So people who have an advanced degree earn on average almost $70,000, and that goes all the way down to people who have not graduated high school earning $22,000. So this is a very stark example of the differences in wages for different amounts of human capital. Other large differences in wages happened for different groups of individuals. So, for example, women compared to men earn 23% less. African Americans earn 42% less compared to whites, and other groups earn different amounts. So I want to talk just a little bit about the difference between earnings between men and women. So this percentage here, this 23%, represents what we would call an unconditional difference in wages. So if we just averaged all of the men and all of the women who are working, this would be the difference between their wages. So does that necessarily mean that all of this difference is due to discrimination? Actually, no. A large part of it is due to men working in different occupations than women, women leaving the workforce in order to raise families. There's a lot that goes into this, and economists have tried a lot of different statistical techniques to estimate how much of this gap between men and women is due to discrimination. And we haven't arrived on a hard answer, but it is definitely substantially less than 23%, which is good. And there are also really bright signs for women in the future. Women graduate college at a much higher rate than men, even at high levels of education such as PhDs. So one topic related to income that has been in the news a lot is inequality. So inequality exists when some workers earn a lot more than others. So why could this be caused? Well, we talked about compensating differentials, talked about discrimination, could be caused by corruption, but not really, and overall it could be caused by differences in marginal product of labor. So let's think about this a little bit. So we have income inequality in the United States. So if we wanted to get rid of it, what would that take? Well, we would need to have all workers having the same skills, ability, and productivity, and all jobs would need to be the same so there are no compensating differentials, and workers would need to be totally mobile. Well, that doesn't sound like a very good situation. When things are too equal, incentives for work are diminished, and incentives to accumulating higher human capital are also diminished. So this chart shows one way you can think about the amount of income inequality in the United States. So this pie chart is divided into 5 different colors, and each of these different colors represents a fifth of workers. Okay, so start with the yellow slice up at the top. That is the amount of income that is earned by the bottom fifth of workers in the United States as measured by their incomes. The second fifth earns 8%, the middle fifth earns 15%, the fourth fifth earns 25% roughly, but the top fifth, the top 20% of earners account for over half of all of the income that is earned in the United States. And if we measured this even finer, if we dove into the top fifth, we would see massive inequality in the top 0.1% of earners. So how can we compare this to other countries? Well, this chart lists 5 developed countries, Japan, Germany, Canada, the UK, and the United States, and then 4 developing countries. And you can see that among the developed countries, the US has the highest income inequality. This is one measure of it, just taking the richest 20% divided by the poorest 20%. And the US has around the same income inequality, slightly less than Mexico, but way less income inequality than some of these other developing nations. So what's going on here? Well, we can think of the US as having higher income inequality than the other developing nations, basically because of the wealthiest people in the United States. So our poverty rate isn't that different than Germany or Canada. So the percent of people who are living below the poverty line in these countries is not that different, surprisingly. What is different is the wealthiest people in the United States are really, really, really wealthy compared to the wealthy in these other countries. And that increases income inequality. However, the developing nations have higher income inequalities because of the low end of their income distribution. So in Namibia, the poor are very, 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 very poor. So that is what's driving their higher income inequality ratio. So it's one thing to keep in mind that inequality can either be because of the rich being very, very rich or the poor being very, very poor. And these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So how would we measure the very, very poor? Well, the most common way that we measure it is by the poverty rate, and that is just calculating the percent of the population whose income is below something called the poverty threshold. And the poverty threshold is determined by the government, and basically the government employs economists and statisticians to try and figure out what level of income would be defined as level below which a family would be living a very meager existence. So what has happened to the poverty rate over the past 50 years? Well, starting in the 1960s, it dropped dramatically, but nothing much has happened since then. So in 1964, the Equal Opportunity Act was passed. In 1965, we had increases in other programs for the lowest income people. That would be, for example, Medicare for the elderly, that provides health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid, which provides health insurance for the very poor. But poverty rate really hasn't changed over the past about 40 years, since 1970. So in part, this is because low-income workers continue to lack the skills necessary to earn living wages, and gains from economic growth have largely accrued to the middle and upper classes rather than the poor. And part of this is due to the increase in technology acting as a substitute for lower wage workers and a complement for higher wage workers. But there's really no easy solution for this. It would probably require long-run investment in education programs targeted at the poor and those with low human capital. So we can look at poverty rates for various groups. Easily the most depressing number on here, I think, is the poverty age for children. 1 out of 5 children lives in a household that is defined as impoverished. And you can look at types of households too, and different races and ethnicities. So what could we do to try and alleviate poverty? So poverty policies face some challenges. So we as a society obviously want to help individuals, but we want individuals to be self-sufficient and productive members of society. So we could think of a couple different kinds of policies that we could use to try and alleviate poverty. Look at welfare, in-kind transfers, the earned income tax credit, and the minimum wage. So welfare is basically giving monetary and other monetary type instruments to poor people. So we have a couple different broad programs. We have the temporary assistance for needy families. This provides financial support to families with dependent children. We have the supplemental security income program that provides income to people who are unable to work. And we have the subsidized nutrition assistance program known as SNAP, that's more popularly known as food stamps. In-kind transfers are direct assistance in the form of goods and services. So these are food banks, housing shelters, private charities, healthcare, and the reason for their existence is largely, I think, that some people feel that if you just give money to poor people, they will misuse it. So some people prefer to give poor people direct forms of goods rather than just money. So I'd like to delve deeper into the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit is basically what is called a negative income tax. So if you have dependent children and you are low income, the earned income tax credit can lower your taxes by as much as $6,000 per year. And it is the largest poverty fighting policy here in the United States. So a negative income tax is a tax that for poor people is negative, so it actually gives you more money than you had before the tax. So you can think of this as a simple example of a negative income tax. So if you make $80,000, then you owe $10,000. But if you have no money, then this negative income tax actually gives you $10,000. A big advantage of the EITC compared to other welfare programs is the income is not at a specific cutoff point. So what this does is it alleviates some disincentives for other income programs. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the last program that we're going to cover a little bit more in depth is the minimum wage. And the minimum wage is a price floor on wages. So we've talked about price floors before. And if we analyze the labor market in the exact same way as we did with supply and demand graph, then we know the problems that price floors can lead to. If you set a price floor above the equilibrium price, that's going to lead to a surplus of the good produced, in that case a surplus of workers or unemployment, and it will decrease the quantity traded. So minimum wage in general, a lot of studies have found this, it increases unemployment. The workers who find jobs are possibly better off because they are paid more than they were before, but other workers who are not lucky enough to find a job are worse off than they would have been before. So another problem with traditional aid is that it creates disincentives to work. So let's consider a family of 5 that earns $20,000 a year and it qualifies for $10,000 in welfare benefits. What happens if they increase their income to $30,000? Well, in the first scenario, their total income is $30,000. In the second example, well, if they earn $30,000, then they may be disqualified for some assistance, so their benefits could fall from $10,000 to $2,000. So they earned $10,000 in extra in income, but they lost $8,000 in benefits. So that's a huge disincentive to work. Okay, so in summary, we talked about determinants of wages, we talked about wage discrimination, and even though the headline number of women earning 75 cents on the dollar gets a lot of press, wage discrimination is actually much smaller than that. But women do still earn less than men. So if we have a market economy, then people's wages will be determined by their value of marginal product, among other things, so we would expect income inequality. And income inequality is not necessarily bad. Poverty rate has been constant for the last 40 years, despite some programs that have tried to alleviate it. And lastly, but not least, we need to be very cognizant of the types of policies that we enact to try and combat poverty because they can create disincentives for work.